It never seems to fail. I'll be at work and a coworker will come up and ask me if I could look at something of theirs. Me being the curious person will always say yes, even if they're not entirely sure what the problem is. I just need to know what's wrong with something. And this leaf blower is that something, and after getting it home, it really had me scratching my head on this one because it's something that I never had to deal with before. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Echo leaf blower, and the problem is that according to my coworker, it starts and runs just fine, but it wants to stop when pointed down. However, if you point it back up, it'll come back to life and stay running. Now, I've only heard about this sort of positional running, but I've never really seen it on a blower before, mostly on string trimmers. Now, I'm going to try and repair this blower, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. I don't recall if I had the pleasure of working on one of these blowers from Echo, but I will say from everything on it, it seems to be a quality machine. But I'm sure I'll get a few comments here and there about other brands being better, so I'll just wait for them to filter in. Now, they did say they replaced the fuel filter and they were concerned about the fuel line, which could be an issue. However, I need to go through the entire fuel system and even check on the health of the engine just to make sure there's nothing else wrong with it. Now, you might be thinking to yourself that it's in pretty good condition. However, if you know me, I probably cleaned it beforehand, which was the case for this one. So this is what it looked like when my coworker handed it to me before I cleaned it. Luckily, it is pretty easy to clean these. But sometimes you might need more than one pass with the cleaner to get it cleaned off. Just remember to give it some time in the sun to dry off before you start to work on it if possible, otherwise you might get some water in the engine. So what usually happens when this issue with the machine running in one position but not in another is that the fuel filter is at some point submerged in the fuel and other times it's not. And depending upon how the machine is tilted will cause the fuel to shift about in the tank. However, there's just one small issue. The fuel line would also have to not allow the filter to shift in the tank with the fuel for that to happen, which means we'll need to take a look at the lines. Now, while the machine is here, I'm also going to check the condition of the spark arrestor screen just to make sure it's not beginning to clog and having some effect on how the way the engine starts and runs. The first thing that I want to do is to examine the fuel that's in the tank, but as you can see, aside from it being a bit heavy with two-stroke oil, there's no water in it and it still smells fresh. Now, if the fuel was old and stale, it might affect the way the engine starts and runs, but that's not the case here. Next, I want to pull the filter out of the tank and check on its condition as well as the fuel line, and from what I can tell, it's not brittle and it also seems to be long enough to allow it to reach most of the fuel in the tank. After that, I'll then disconnect the fuel lines from the carb and then take the carb off the engine for an inspection. Unfortunately, from everything I've seen so far, I don't see how pointing the blower down is affecting how it's running. Instead, my guess is that it's a carb issue, either it's giving too much fuel to the engine or not enough. And when it starts to have its little issues and my coworker stops squeezing the trigger, I think that's when it's able to run normally again. Now this is really interesting, at least to me. Take a look at this cover over the extra linkage on the carb. Not really sure why it's like this, but I'm guessing that this was an adaptation of an older design because they made a change to an EPA-friendly carb. The first thing that I want to look at is the metering diaphragm and see if it's beginning to harden. The reason why is because for it to do its job to control fuel flow, it needs to be flexible, and if it's not as flexible as it's supposed to be, it can't do that. Now, strangely enough, the diaphragm is pretty flexible. However, it is showing some signs of hardening and it wouldn't hurt to replace it. If I had to rate this diaphragm, I'd say it was still usable, but since I carry this type of diaphragm in my tool bag, I am going to replace it. Next, I'm going to take off the purge bulb section along with the fuel pump and see if the inlet screen is clogged with debris. And surprisingly, the screen is not clogged with anything. I would have thought that with the filter having an issue, the screen would have had some debris on it, but that's not the case here. The next thing I'm going to do is to take the majority of the carb apart. That way I can put it into my cleaner for a long hot bath along with some sonic cleaning. I did run into one small problem, and I mean tiny one, when I found a miniature roller in the bath, but I was able to find where it went later on. So what are my thoughts about this cleaner? Well, at this point, I really don't care for it. It seems to be more trouble than it's worth, even though plenty of viewers are going to disagree with me. So right now, my plan is to keep using it as much as possible until it breaks, and when it does, I'm going to take it apart to examine it and see if I can make it any better. Unfortunately, because of its size, it's not as cheap as I was hoping for, so hopefully I can get as much use out of it as possible, and it's comparable to a whole case of carb cleaner, but I doubt that's going to happen. Now, just to answer a commenter's question, this little white capsule is a tank vent. It's basically a one-way check valve in a fancy holder. Inside, you'll find a tiny piece of foam to filter the air that'll pass through a duckbill. Now this bill allows air to displace the fuel in the tank, and without this part, fuel will not want to travel to the carb and make the engine stop after a few minutes of running. On some of the less expensive machines, this duct bill is built into the fuel cap, and that's why you might only see 2 fuel lines coming out of the tank. So as far as I can tell, one design isn't any better than the other, but I'm guessing it's an issue of cost more than anything else. Next, I want to take out the spark arrestor screen to inspect it for a buildup of excess carbon. Now to make filming just a bit easier, I took off the discharge pipe, but you really don't have to unless you want to. After taking the bolts out and the deflector, you can see the screen, and to be honest, even without taking it out and just using a flashlight, you can see there's no buildup on it whatsoever, which is good enough for me, so I'm just going to put everything back on. Now if it had a small amount of carbon buildup on it, I would obviously take it out and clean it and then put it back on. The next thing that I want to do is to check on the health of the engine, and of course to do that, I'm going to use my compression tester. The tester simply screws into the spark plug opening and will measure how much pressure the engine can make on the compression stroke. The higher the reading, the healthier it is, and for a reference, a good reading would be something in the 150 psi range. Now to use the tester, just take the spark plug out, screw in the tester, squeeze the trigger, and then pull on the rope several times. As you can see, the reading is exactly 150 psi, which tells me this engine is very healthy and worth saving. But what happens if you get a reading less than that? Well, it just means there's some wear on the engine, but there is a point where it may not be worth fixing. While I have the spark plug out of the engine, I'm also going to check its gap, and for this one, I like to use my 25 thousandths feeler. If it's too tight, I'll widen it. If it's too big, I'll gently tap this end of the plug on a piece of wood to close the gap. I'm also going to clean the carbon that's on the end of the plug by using my torch, but there are other ways to do this. However, this is the way I like to do it because it's easier, although it can be a bit dangerous. After using a wire brush to remove the ash, I'll then carefully install it back into the engine and then tighten it down. Then we'll go and check on the parts in the deep fryer. Now the parts have been in here for about 20 to 25 minutes, and I have to admit they do look a lot better, but I still had to wipe off the really bad parts and use compressed air to blow out all the passages. So as you can tell, I'm still trying to figure out the value of this ultrasonic cleaner. If I still have to do most of the stuff I had to do without a cleaner, what's the point in even having one then? All I really saved was not having to use a can of carb cleaner, which doesn't sound like a good investment at this point. I will admit the parts look better, but that doesn't matter much if the carb doesn't work. So what would I normally do if I didn't have an ultrasonic cleaner then? Well, I would take it apart, spray carb cleaner on all the parts that look dirty, and in any openings I could find. I then used compressed air to help clear any openings I felt didn't get cleared with carb cleaner. It's pretty much what I just did, except I didn't have a can of carb cleaner in my hands and I was out $150 for my wallet. So am I a bit disappointed in my purchase? Well, I wouldn't say disappointed, but it certainly did not live up to what I was told about getting one.
Oh, you should get one. It'll make cleaning a carb so much easier.
Or I like this one the best.
You could have saved that OEM carb if you had just used an ultrasonic cleaner, then you wouldn't have to buy a cheap aftermarket carb.
I just want to let you know that you need to find the right methods to take apart a carb, what solutions you need to use, and any other tips or tricks to make this tool work better for you. And right now, I'm still doing a lot of trial and error, and it's been really tough to say the least. If you recall, I rated this diaphragm as still usable, so I want to try and save this one by putting it into my rejuvenation bath. That way, if for some reason I'm caught off guard and I run out of this particular style of diaphragm, I'll have this one as a backup until the new ones arrive. I buy these diaphragms in large packs, which basically makes each one $1 a piece. But if you were going to buy a single one, it might be as much as $5 or more, so if I were you, I'd buy a pack of at least 5 and keep the rest for later or sell them off. Now the intake gasket between the carb and the insulator came off, but an easy way to figure out how to put it back on would be to line up the small hole in the gasket to the one that's on the back of the carb. It might be helpful for future work if you just glued the gasket in place on the insulator, but it's not necessary. Now surprisingly, the air filter is in really good condition. It's not new, but it's also not soaked with oil or fuel, and there's hardly any dirt on it. I can only guess that my coworker replaced it at some point, and I wouldn't be surprised if they changed the spark plug as well. Someone asked me how often I changed my spark plugs, and my answer is, for small engines, hardly ever. I only change them if I suspect there's an issue with them. I also never changed them as part of a yearly tune-up. There's nothing wrong if you do, I just don't do it, and it's kept me from throwing away a lot of spark plugs into the landfills. After pressing the bulb a few times and now that it's full of fuel, I think it's time to try out the blower. So by the way it's acting, which is to only run on choke and barely off of it, it would seem the engine wants more fuel from the carb. Now for this carb, we need to turn a tiny flathead in the middle of the brass part of the barrel on top of the carb. To increase fuel flow, we want to turn the screw counterclockwise, and we'll start with half a turn based on how the engine is running. So it is better, and I think we're on the right path of adding more fuel, so I'll turn it just a little bit more, and hopefully that should do the trick. So after servicing the carb and a minor adjustment, it's now starting and running the way it's supposed to. When starting in full choke, the engine's supposed to start and run but die, then the blower should start and run in partial choke, and finally you should then move the choke lever to the run position and then be able to use the blower normally. Now there is a bit more tuning we need to do to it to get it to run really well, but I'll leave that for another day. Right now we're just getting it to start and run and be usable again versus what it was doing before. Now this blower doesn't look to have been neglected in any way at all in the last several years, and hopefully it'll still be useful for the next decade, just so long as they use good fuel, but you never know what might happen in the future. So my question is, what brand of leaf blower do you prefer? A name brand one like Echo, Steel, or even Shindaiwa, or is a cheaper blower just fine for what you need it to do? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.